The world of cinema has gone quiet. Not the kind of silence that follows applause, but the kind that comes when a soul too luminous to replace finally fades. Diane Keaton, the heartbeat of Hollywood's golden age, has left us at 79. A woman who turned awkwardness into charm, who made imperfection divine, and who showed generations that laughter could heal even the deepest loneliness, is gone. Across the globe, tributes poured in like candlelight. From Broadway to Beverly Hills, from New York cafes to Italian film festivals, the world bowed its head. But among all the voices, one rose softly above the rest. Goldie Hawn, her co-star, her confidant, her mirror in laughter and pain. When Goldie stepped forward to speak at the private farewell, her voice cracked, not from performance, but from the kind of grief that only truth can cause. "She was the sister I never had," she said, eyes trembling. And the silence she leaves behind is deafening. That silence, the one Diane spent her entire life trying to understand, translate, and soften with laughter, has finally returned. But before we join that stillness, before the curtain closes on this immortal spirit, we look back at the girl who grew up afraid to speak, a woman who taught the world to listen, and the legend whose laughter refuses to die, because this isn't just the story of Diane Keaton's death. It's the story of how she lived, fiercely, truthfully, and beautifully, until the very end. Long before the red carpets and applause, Diane Keaton's life began in a kind of quiet that could shape destinies. She was born Diane Hall on January 5, 1946, beneath the bright skies of Los Angeles, a place that promised glamour but hid loneliness behind every perfect smile. Her home looked ordinary from the outside, but inside, emotions were kept under lock and key. Her father, Jack Hall, believed in rules more than tenderness. Her mother, Dorothy, once a beauty queen crowned Mrs. Los Angeles 1955, carried within her the fading embers of abandoned dreams. Diane often watched her mother's reflection dim, not from tragedy, but from quiet surrender. The applause Dorothy once heard was replaced by the sound of dishes clattering in the kitchen, the hum of domestic life that felt more like a cage than comfort. For Diane, it was a silent warning, a glimpse of what happens when a woman's fire is forced into silence. "We didn't talk about feelings," she once said. "We simply lived inside them." That single sentence became the foundation of everything she would later create. Each pause in her performances, each awkward laugh, each trembling line, all of it came from that silence she carried like a second heartbeat. As a child, she didn't just grow up in Los Angeles. She grew up inside the tension between what people showed and what they truly felt out at school. She was the odd one out, too tall, too dreamy, too unwilling to fit in. But what others saw as strangeness was simply depth waiting to be understood. She studied faces, gestures, the way people lied with smiles. Even then, she was learning her craft without realizing it, turning pain into observation, observation into art, that her mother's unfinished dreams didn't fade completely. They simply passed on, reborn in her daughter's ambition. Diane once said her mother's life wasn't a map, it was a warning. And that warning became her drive. While other girls in the 1950s dreamed of husbands and homes, Diane dreamed of escape, a stage, a script, a life big enough to hold her voice. She found it one evening in a dimly lit high school auditorium, standing beneath a trembling spotlight as Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire. The audience saw a nervous teenager, but Diane felt something divine. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to be seen. That performance wasn't just an act. It was survival. From that night on, she made a silent promise to herself. She would never let her mother's silence become her own. She would speak through art, through laughter, through every trembling truth she carried. And even though the world had yet to know her name, The girl who once whispered her dreams into the dark had already begun her transformation from the daughter of quiet to the woman who would one day teach the world how to listen. By the winter of 1966, the silence of Diane's childhood had followed her east, not as a curse, but as a companion. With one battered suitcase, 2 wrinkled scripts, and a heart trembling between fear and faith, she boarded a Greyhound bus from Los Angeles to New York City. She wasn't chasing fame. She was running toward a life that felt real. The city greeted her without mercy. The cold was sharper than truth, the air thick with ambition and cigarette smoke. She found a tiny apartment on the Upper West Side, a cracked window, peeling wallpaper, and a radiator that coughed instead of heating. Nights were long, and the only thing louder than the traffic outside was the hunger inside her. She wrapped herself in her coat and whispered, "Not yet." It became her prayer. Every morning, she stood in endless lines for auditions that ended with the same words. Too tall, too plain, not the type. By noon, she was waitressing for tips too small to cover rent. By night, she sang in smoky basements where nobody remembered her name. Still, she showed up, trembling, barefoot sometimes, but determined to be seen. "Fear became my engine," she would later say. "If I was afraid, it meant I was alive." She pawned her shoes to pay rent, skipped the subway to save a dime, and wrote dialogue by candlelight when the power went out. When despair crept in, she'd place her palms on the frozen windowpane and whisper into the dark, "I'm still here." The city didn't answer, but it didn't destroy her either. Somewhere between the hunger and the rejection, something in her began to harden into strength. Then, one afternoon in 1968, after 2 years of struggle, she saw an audition notice for a new Broadway revival, Hair. It called for someone raw, unpolished, painfully real. Diane walked in barefoot, her nerves visible, her voice trembling. But for the first time, she didn't try to be perfect. She simply was. The director sat in silence, then finally said, "Don't change a thing." That night, under the blinding heat of the stage lights, everything shifted. The applause was thunder, but what filled her chest was something quieter, recognition. The silence she had carried all her life finally broke, replaced by the sound of a world that was, at last, listening. She built herself from that moment, not out of confidence, but out of fear, hunger, and defiance. Every no became a lesson. Every empty stomach became fuel. Every rejection shaped the poise and vulnerability that would one day define her on-screen magic. Long before The Godfather, before Annie Hall, before the world called her brilliant, she was just a young woman walking through snow with nothing but faith in her voice and light in her heart. New York didn't give her success. It forged her survival. And from that survival, a legend began to rise. The first flash of the camera felt like thunder. Diane blinked beneath the glare, uncertain if the light was meant to honor her or consume her. The girl who once sang for coins in smoke-filled basements was now standing in front of the world. The Godfather had changed everything. It was 1972, and with the role of Kay Adams, she became the soft heartbeat inside cinema's most ruthless world. She didn't just play Al Pacino's wife. She became the human soul inside Michael Corleone's empire. Viewers saw it instantly, the trembling compassion in her voice, the pain hiding behind her eyes. Diane wasn't pretending to understand broken love. She lived it, and the screen couldn't look away. Fame arrived like an avalanche, swift, dazzling, and impossible to escape. Scripts piled high. Her name glowed on billboards. Yet even in that blinding success, Diane felt a familiar quiet echoing through her. She'd spent her life chasing light, and now that she stood in it, she found it could still cast shadows. Then came 1977, Annie Hall, A film that didn't just define a career, but an era. That hesitant smile, that nervous laugh, that wardrobe of turtlenecks and ties. They weren't costumes. They were her. Annie Hall wasn't a character. She was Diane's mirror. Audiences didn't fall in love with the performance. They fell in love with her truth. She made imperfection radiant and awkwardness irresistible. That year, when she stood on stage holding the Oscar, her hands trembled. She smiled, thanked the world, and walked off into history. But that night, alone in her kitchen, she stared at the golden statue resting beside an untouched glass of wine. "Is this what it feels like to be seen?" She whispered to no one. The applause still rang in her ears, but it no longer comforted her. It reminded her of everything she had sacrificed to get there, because fame, she discovered, wasn't peace. It was a spotlight that burned as much as it blessed. Every new role came with the same unspoken question. Can you ever be that good again? She answered it not with words, but with work, lines rewritten at 3 a.m., scenes rehearsed until her voice cracked, endless nights where the only sound in her home was the scratching of pen on paper. She didn't chase perfection for praise. She chased it to silence the fear that still whispered from her childhood walls. And though the world saw a star ascending, Diane knew the truth, that every bright ascent carries the seeds of its own loneliness. Because in the glare of success, she began to realize something that would haunt her for years. Applause fades. Silence doesn't. Fame had finally found her, but it didn't bring peace. It brought pressure, the kind that seeps quietly into your bones. The world saw Diane Keaton as the woman who could do no wrong, the Oscar winner, the style icon, the quirky genius whose laughter lit up screens. But behind the cameras, the applause became a question she could never stop hearing. Can I live up to what they see in me? The perfection that had once fueled her now began to consume her. She filled journals with rewrites, notes, and endless doubts. Her friends called her disciplined. She called it survival. She worked late into the night, surrounded by stacks of half-finished scripts and cold cups of coffee, terrified that slowing down would make the silence rush back in. "I didn't sleep," she later admitted. "I was scared to stop." When Warren Beatty cast her in Reds, 1981, he demanded everything, and she gave it. The result was electric, the kind of performance critics call fearless. But Diane didn't feel fearless. She felt hollow, as though each scene had carved a piece out of her. After shooting Wrapped, she sat in her car and cried, not from sadness, but because there was nothing left inside to give. The world called her courageous. She called herself exhausted. Then came the 1980s, slow and unkind. The Little Drummer Girl flopped. Scripts grew thinner. Hollywood moved on to younger faces. "Everyone thought I was still on top," she confessed later. But inside, I was slipping. The spotlight that once warmed her now felt cold. The same laughter that made her famous had started to feel like armor. But Diane wasn't made to vanish. Instead of fighting the silence, she learned to listen to it again. She turned down million-dollar offers, walked away from projects that didn't speak to her soul, and began writing and directing. For the first time since Annie Hall, she allowed herself to breathe. When a young actress once asked how to survive in Hollywood, Diane simply said, "The applause fades. The work, that's what saves you." In that stillness, she rediscovered herself. The woman who once chased perfection began to chase truth. She found beauty in imperfection, grace in restraint, and art in the spaces between noise and quiet. Every sleepless night, every trembling line, every tear shed in private became part of her evolution. For Diane Keaton, success was never about staying famous. It was about staying honest. She learned that true greatness isn't loud. It whispers, just like she once did, back when the world still called her strange. And through that whisper, she found strength again, preparing for the next chapter that would change her life forever. Because in 1996, when the laughter of the First Wives Club filled the screen, Diane would find something she never expected, a friendship that healed, the very silence she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. When Diane Keaton met Goldie Hawn on the set of the First Wives Club in 1996. It wasn't just another Hollywood collaboration. It was the beginning of a bond that would become one of the most genuine friendships the industry had ever seen. Two women, two different energies, both legends, both survivors. One moved like sunlight, the other like shadow, but together they created balance. Diane was 50, measured and meticulous, arriving early to every shoot with her script annotated in neat pencil marks. Goldie was effervescent, breezing into the set with laughter that filled every corner of the room. At first, their worlds seemed opposite, structure meeting spontaneity, order meeting chaos. But behind the camera's lens, something beautiful unfolded. One cold evening, while filming on a New York street, Goldie noticed Diane shivering quietly in her chair between takes. Without hesitation, she took off her own coat and wrapped it around Diane's shoulders. "You're always the strong one," Goldie whispered. "Let someone else carry it for a while." Diane smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and that moment became the quiet spark of sisterhood. From that night on, they were inseparable. They didn't compete. They completed each other. Between takes, they shared secrets about heartbreak, aging, and the invisible wounds fame never heals. They laughed until tears rolled down their faces, cried when words ran out, and built a friendship out of truth, not vanity. Goldie once said, "Diane made me feel safe being human." Diane replied, "She reminded me laughter can be a kind of prayer." In an industry built on image, they found comfort in imperfection. When awards came, they toasted each other's success. When disappointments hit, they disappeared into kitchens, wine glasses in hand, letting silence speak. They didn't need cameras or applause, just the knowing glance of two women who had lived through the same storms. Years later, Diane would say that Goldie was her mirror in laughter, the one who saw beyond the hats, beyond the nervous tics, to the woman still healing underneath. And Goldie, in return, called Diane her anchor. "She was calm in my chaos," she told a friend. "When the lights went off, she was the one who stayed." So when the news of Diane's passing broke, Goldie's world dimmed. The woman who had taught her that laughter could outlast pain was gone. At the memorial in Los Angeles, she stood near the front, clutching a single white rose. Her hands trembled as she tried to lay it down. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Diane was more than brilliant," she said. "She was brave. She didn't just make us laugh, she gave us permission to be real." Those words hung in the air, trembling like prayer. Even Hollywood, a place built on illusion, fell silent. Because this was no performance. This was love, unfiltered and eternal. And as the service ended and the crowd slowly drifted away, Goldie stayed behind. The sunlight outside had turned soft and golden, the same hue as Diane's hair under the studio lamps years ago. She placed the rose beside Diane's portrait, her fingers grazing the glass. "I'll keep laughing for both of us," she whispered. Then she turned, her reflection mingling with Diane's in the frame. Two women forever joined by the kind of bond that even time can't erase. And somewhere in that stillness, Goldie swore she heard it, that familiar, radiant laugh. Faint, fleeting, but alive. For most of her career, the world saw Diane Keaton as the eternal muse, the fearless performer, the style icon, the woman who seemed to belong entirely to the screen. But what most didn't see was that behind the applause, she carried a quiet ache, the longing for something real something that couldn't be written into a script. That longing led her to one of the most defining choices of her life. In 1996, at the age of 50, while Hollywood was celebrating her comeback in the First Wives Club, Diane was making a far more personal decision to become a mother. She adopted a baby girl named Dexter, and everything changed. "I was terrified," she once admitted, "but I was more afraid of being alone forever." The woman who once performed for the world suddenly found her purpose in the sound of a baby's laughter echoing through her home. Gone were the long nights spent chasing perfection. Instead, there were sleepless nights filled with lullabies, spilled milk, and whispered prayers. She didn't care if she got the lines wrong anymore, only that her daughter knew she was loved. 5 years later, Diane's family grew again when she adopted a baby boy, Duke. His arrival filled the house with the kind of laughter she had spent a lifetime trying to create through art. "He made me brave again," she told a friend. And from that moment on, fame took a back seat. Diane no longer lived for the camera. She lived for breakfast conversations, burnt toast, and bedtime hugs. Her home in Los Angeles became her sanctuary, walls lined with black and white photographs. Stacks of books and hundreds of her signature hats hung like memories. Each corner told a story, not of celebrity, but of love. She left notes for her kids on mirrors. "You're doing great. Don't forget to laugh. Love is the only thing that lasts." Dexter once said, "She didn't just raise us. She rebuilt herself through us." And Duke, in one of his rare interviews, described her as everything gentle. He remembered how she would call at midnight just to ask if he'd eaten, and again at sunrise to remind him she loved him. She wasn't perfect, but she was present. And in the end, that was everything. When Diane passed, her home fell into a silence that felt almost sacred. The hat still hung by the door. Her glasses rested open beside a cold cup of tea. Her favorite chair by the window was untouched, the blanket still draped across its arm. Her daughter whispered, "It feels like the house is holding its breath." For the world, Diane Keaton was an icon, the woman who taught cinema how to fall in love with truth. But for her children, she was warmth itself, the heartbeat of their home, the quiet light that guided them through every storm. And even now, when the wind moves through the jacaranda trees outside her Los Angeles home, it sounds almost like her laughter, soft, fleeting, but alive. Because some loves don't end when life does. They just become the air the living learn to breathe. In her final months, Diane Keaton did what she had always done. She turned solitude into sanctuary. After the Los Angeles wildfires scorched part of her property, she quietly left the noise of the city behind and retreated to Palm Springs. There, surrounded by wind, light, and silence, she began what friends later called her second act of peace. Her close friend, songwriter Carol Bayer Sager, was one of the last people to see her. "She'd lost so much weight," Carol whispered, "but she never stopped smiling." That smile, the same one that had carried her through decades of pain and triumph, remained even as her body weakened. Diane would wake before sunrise, barefoot on cool tile floors, a camera always in hand. She called it chasing small miracles, the glint of dust caught in sunlight, a bird's wings slicing through the desert air, a shadow dancing on stucco. She said these moments were proof that beauty could still exist quietly, without applause. Palm Springs became her cathedral. Every photograph she took in those last weeks was a kind of prayer, unprinted, unnamed, but filled with her soul. She knew, perhaps, that her time was near. Yet there was no fear, only gratitude. She once told Carol, "I don't think life ends. It just changes its language." On October 11th, 2025, the news broke. Diane Keaton was gone. For a few suspended moments, Hollywood stopped breathing. The same city that had once overlooked her now mourned her like royalty. Outside her Los Angeles home, fans gathered quietly. Some carried Lily, her favorite flower. Others left her trademark hats along the gate, lined like sentinels guarding her memory. A single note written in blue ink fluttered in the wind. You made me brave enough to be myself. Across the country, movie theaters dimmed their lights before late-night showings of Annie Hall. In New York, Broadway actors paused for a moment of silence. And in Palm Springs, as the sun sank behind the mountains, a small crowd stood in the desert she had loved so deeply. There were no cameras, no speeches, no music. Only wind dot, it moved gently through the dry grass, carrying warmth and memory. To some, it sounded almost like laughter, faint but unmistakable, as if the desert itself was whispering her final gift back to the world. To Hollywood, her passing marked the end of an era. To her children, it was the loss of their compass. To her friends, it was the silence after a lifelong song. But to the world, to every soul she ever touched through her words, her smile, or her art, it was a reminder that some lights don't go out when life does. They simply learn how to shine differently, softer, deeper, and eternal. There are stars who dazzle, and then there are souls who redefine what it means to live. Diane Keaton belonged to the latter, not just a performer, but a quiet revolution wrapped in laughter, courage, and grace. She didn't conquer Hollywood by being perfect. She conquered it by daring to be a real dot in an industry obsessed with polish. She made imperfection poetic. In a world that worshipped youth, she made aging luminous. Every awkward pause, every hesitant smile, every tremor in her laugh, it was all deliberate, all human, all her. She didn't just play characters. She revealed pieces of herself in each one. Annie Hall taught us that endings can still be beautiful. Something's Gotta Give taught us that love doesn't belong to youth. It belongs to those brave enough to still believe in it. Off-screen, she lived the same way she acted, honestly. She never demanded attention, but wherever she stood, the room seemed to soften. Crew members said she remembered their names. Young actresses said she made them feel seen. Photographers recalled her whispering, "Let's make something honest." She didn't hide her quirks. She wore them like medals. She didn't chase perfection. She turned vulnerability into art. To her peers, Diane was a compass. She reminded them that fame without integrity is empty. To her fans, she was permission. Permission to age without apology, to stumble without shame, to laugh without pretending. Her influence rippled quietly through generations of women who realized that beauty isn't symmetry, it's sincerity. And when people asked how she wanted to be remembered, her work gave the answer, through laughter. Not the loud, artificial kind, but the deep, trembling laughter that carries truth. That was her rebellion. That was her art. Today, as the world continues to mourn, her spirit lingers everywhere, in the flicker of an old film, in the brim of a wide hat, in the wind of Palm Springs that still hums with her name. Goldie Hawn still keeps that promise she made at the funeral. I'll keep laughing for both of us. And somewhere, in the quiet between dawn and day, that laughter seems to echo back, faint, warm, eternal. Because Diane Keaton didn't just leave behind performances. She left behind permission to feel, to fail, to forgive, to laugh even when life trembles. She once said, "Art is forgiving the world for breaking your heart." Maybe that's what she was doing all along, forgiving, creating, and teaching us how to live gently in a world that T. So tonight, as her films play in living rooms around the world, may we not mourn her with tears, but with gratitude. May we whisper her name not in sorrow, but in celebration, because her light hasn't gone out. It simply found a softer way to burn, in laughter, in love, and in the silence she turned into music. Forever Diane Keaton. Forever laughter that refuses to die. The church bells in Los Angeles have long stopped ringing, but the echo of Diane Keaton's spirit still lingers, not in sound, but in feeling. Her story doesn't end with a final scene or a fading frame. It continues in every life she quietly touched, in every person who ever saw themselves in her trembling honesty, her awkward grace, her fearless laughter. For those who knew her best, grief isn't a loud thing. It's the soft rustle of a page turning, the light flicker of a candle that refuses to go out. Goldie Hawn still keeps a white rose pressed between the pages of Diane's last letter. Dexter still walks past her mother's camera by the window, afraid to move it, as if the light inside might escape. And Duke still swears that some nights he hears her humming, faintly, from the garden, as if she never left at all, because legends don't vanish. They evolve. They dissolve into the stories we tell, the art we cherish, the laughter we repeat to remind ourselves that life is meant to be felt. Not perfected. Diane Keaton lived that truth to her last breath. She showed the world that you don't have to be fearless to be brave. You just have to keep showing up. She taught us that laughter can heal what silence breaks, and that the truest art is born from the courage to be seen, exactly as you are. As the sun dips behind the California hills, the world grows a little quieter. Somewhere, a fan replays Annie Hall, smiling through tears. Somewhere else, a young actress stands before a mirror, whispering Diane's words to herself. Don't try to be perfect. Just be real. And maybe that's her greatest legacy. Not the trophies, not the timeless roles, but the invitation she left behind for all of us, to live with wonder, to forgive our flaws, to love like it still matters, and to find beauty in every imperfection, because Diane Keaton was never just acting. She was teaching the world how to live. So this isn't goodbye, not really. It's just one last curtain call for a woman whose laughter became light, whose silence became art, and whose spirit still dances softly through the spaces she once filled. Rest in grace. Diane, your voice still echoes, your light still burns, and your laughter, that trembling, fearless, unforgettable laughter, will never fade.